Welcome to the second session and the second series of lectures on the course Social Organization. Our topic for tonight is the continuation of what we began last week, social organization focusing on social environment and interest. The idea of social environment is one that we're going to define first, and after we discuss that, then we'll move on and think about the issue of social interest. In looking at social environment, we're primarily interested in human activities. I use that term, and it's so ordinary. You think, well, so what? Well, activities are the things that people do. And what we're going to look at tonight is how you study the things that people do, how you learn significant things from what they do, about how they think. We're going to look at how you learn from their activities, how they organize themselves in their world and in their culture. We're going to try to give you some tools so that you can watch an activity, you can gather data from it, you can record that data, you can then think it through, process it, and really dig much deeper into what's behind what people do in a culture. To help you illustrate that, I'm going to work first of all with James Mbuva, who was with me last week, and I'll be interviewing him about some activities in Kenya. And then we'll be looking at the case study of Ruth in the second hour and looking at that biblical activity and showing how we can take these kinds of activities and dig much deeper into them with some very focused questions that come from the study of social organization. As we think about human activities, last week we talked about life histories and thought about how the life history is an important part of a person's story. And a life history is really the story of a person going through a culture. It's how I tell how I lived it and what happened to me in it. And it's important for us to get that kind of information because it really helps us to know people as they journey through their own cultural experience. And it helps us to understand how they interpret and give meaning to that particular experience. Tonight we're going to be looking at social events. We're going to be looking at the kind of things that happen in a culture, the kind of things that you would see if you were there, and how to understand that and decipher it. I've had some very interesting experiences in my work with Wycliffe Bible translators over the last 2 decades. A few years ago I was down in the country of Suriname in South America. And I went with one of my SIL colleagues up the river to the particular village where he was, and we walked into that village right into the middle of a funeral. Now, I didn't understand the language. I didn't know anything about the culture. This was my first day there, and here I was in the midst of this very, very significant event in that culture. That experience could have been a very boring experience. For those of you that have lived and worked cross-culturally and have been to funerals, you know they're long, tedious events. They're events where a lot of things happen. If you don't know the language, you don't know what's going on. Now, I had all these tools in my mind, and so I went into that funeral, and I sat down, and I began to watch. And I did everything that I'm going to talk to you about tonight without knowing the language. I made a map of the things that were happening in that setting. I took notes of all the sequence. I developed a program of the funeral as I watched it so that I knew what was going on. And then as I developed that program, I identified people. I didn't know their names. I didn't know who they were, but I described them for myself, identified the places where they were, and then my friend Bob was sitting next to me. I said, "Bob, who's that? And who's this guy? Who's the other guy?" And I began to identify people and what they were doing. Later on, after the funeral was over, I said, "Okay, Bob, how's this guy related to that one?" "Well, I don't know." So we went out and found out. Now, by my sitting there and I only had one sheet of white paper. I don't have even one tonight to use. I had folded it all up to be very small. I had a pencil, and I didn't want a great big notebook because here I'm first day in the village. I'm a guest in this place. I'm sitting here in the middle of a funeral. I don't want to make a spectacle of myself. So I'm sitting there very carefully and watching, and just every once in a while open that in my hand, take a little note on that sheet of paper. The paper is that narrow. It's so small, but when I fill up that one section, I'd unfold it, fold it in another direction. I kept on filling that paper up. By the end of the day, that paper was full. And I then sat down with my friend Bob, and I processed what I'd been looking at today. He knew more about it than I did, and so I was able to get information from him. But from that time, just sitting there and having this basic framework that we're going to talk about tonight, I gathered a whole host of information about a funeral. Now, I can tell you that I learned an awful lot about that culture and those people in those 2 days because I was very focused. I was asking very specific questions. I knew what to record. I knew then how to follow up with questions that were the tools that I had to work with. And that's really what we're about tonight. We're here to give you some tools that you can take even if you don't know what's going on, if you don't know anything about the language. If you become a very sharp observer, you can then gather information that will help you get deeper into their meanings, into their understandings of the world, their world, and into the significant things about their lives. A funeral is a very significant occasion. And in fact, I think every missionary, everybody working in cross-cultural ministries should study funerals and should understand them completely. Number one, they always happen. You can be sure you're going to be at them. Number two, they're places where people are dealing with the very most significant issue in their life, death. And how they interpret that, how they understand it, how they process it, what meanings they give to it. It's also a time when they're probably more open than other times to talk to you about the meaning of life. It's a time that you can begin to probe deeply into their life. So an event, a social event like a funeral, is really a very significant moment. Our goal in all of this is to understand meaning. We're really trying to get at what is behind the activities that people do. How do they interpret it in their minds? How does it become a part of their belief and worldview? And how do these beliefs provide obstacles for them to the gospel or provide opportunities for us to be able to reach to them with the gospel, to share Christ with them? All right, in working to understand a social environment, there were a number of different steps that we will follow. And if you did your reading for tonight, I'll get my book out here. If you had this book assignment, you had the chapter on understanding social environment as part of your assignment for this evening. In that particular chapter, we talk about some very specific things to do in reference to understanding a social environment. The first thing we want to look at is just the place where things are happening. It's interesting that doesn't seem like such a big deal, but you know, places happen where people think they ought to happen. I mean, events happen where people think they ought to happen. If it happens in the wrong place, they can get upset about it. If it happens in a place where there are particular problems, then they have to work through those problems. So the place that people do things is very important. And so the first step we have is to understand the place. Up here we have a map. It's a map of a place. We're going to talk about that a little bit later tonight. But as you look at this particular map, you can see that there's stuff on it. That's the first step you need to do in terms of understanding a place, understanding a social environment. You just need to define what is the space there. Now, it's interesting, I asked James to create this map tonight. If you were there and you were making the map, you would make it probably differently than he did. He made a map that defines the things that are important in his mind. And if you can get people to make their own maps, they will tell you the things that to them are important about that space. And they will define things in a way that are meaningful to them. So as you're doing your project for this class, and you're working with somebody, you may begin with, they may tell you a story about something that happened. Ask them to tell you about the place. Ask them to tell you about the things that were important about that place. And then you can go ahead and process that information. Of course, once you have the place, then you need to know the people that are there. That's what I did when I went to the funeral. I began to try to understand the people and who was involved in that particular place. It was hard for me because I didn't know them. I hadn't been there before. I had nothing to base my information on. So I had to be able to connect this with somebody else who knew to provide that help to consider who's doing things. Now, when you have a funeral, you have maybe hundreds of people there. It's not important to know everybody who's there. If you were there for a long time, I'd want to know everybody that was there. But in a situation like that, you really want to find out who the key players are. First, who's dead? Okay. Secondly, who are the closest relatives of the person who died? Who has responsibility for the funeral? What are the kinds of things that happen? And then you begin to see who has the roles that are part of that particular event. So the people are important. But more important than the people are the relationships. Because you see, just knowing who the person is doesn't tell you why they're there and what they're doing. And if you really don't know why they're there and what they're doing, then you don't understand the connections and the meanings that are important to the people in that context. Again, the relationships are hidden. You can't find them just by watching. You have to ask underneath. That's why we talked about genealogy last week. The genealogy gives you a way of deciphering relationships and knowing how people are connected in the community without having to ask every time. If you do a few selective genealogies, you can have a social map of relationships in a community. And so when you see so-and-so, you say, oh, you know, he's the uncle of the person who died. You know that other person is the mother. You know the other person is the child. You know that the other person are brothers or sisters. And you can begin to identify those relationships. What you'll find is that they have special places. and special responsibilities and special obligations at the event that you're looking at. And so knowing the relationships is really crucial to understanding the activity itself. What happens? In other words, how does this activity proceed? What's going on in the content of what is there? Usually you want to find out what's the purpose of this thing. For example, we talked about the funeral. You know what the purpose of a funeral is. But you might find a group of people gathered around and getting a lot of food together, and you see them collecting in a particular place, but you don't know why they're gathering food. You don't know why they're collecting in the place. You don't know what the event is. You have to ask around and find out what's the purpose of this thing. Every social event of any kind of significance has some social purpose, and it will have an explicit purpose. It will also have hidden purposes, and you need to find out what both the explicit purposes are and what the hidden purposes are as you work with people. And then finally you have the issue of time. There's always a calendar. When it should begin, when it should end. I remember attending many social events on YAP, and they always announced the time when they were going to start, and they would tell you how long it was going to go. Well, it never started when they announced it was going to. It always started at least 2 or 3 hours later. But if 3 hours went by and they hadn't started yet, then they were upset. Hey, we're late. But they weren't late until 3 hours had gone by. Well, I soon learned not to come until 2 hours at least, because nobody else did. But one time I was attending a meeting and I was 3 hours late. I thought to myself, oh no, I'm going to miss this thing. I may have missed something significant. And so I rushed to get there, and I found that I was 5 minutes early, that they were just getting ready to start. So I was getting good enough to guess in that culture about the time and when it would start and know how to process these things. The other thing is when it's going to end. Oftentimes it doesn't end when they say it's going to end. They end when they're finished. And if it takes longer, for example, a funeral's going to go 3 days. Well, so-and-so didn't come. And we're waiting, and we don't know why he didn't come, and so we're going to wait until he gets there. And so it may stretch on to 4 days, 5 days, until that particular person gets there. Well, this creates some difficulties if you're at a funeral, because in most of these countries there's no embalming. And so the flies get worse on the 3rd day, and they get worse on the 4th day, and it becomes something where people say, we really need to go on. And there's anxiety about finishing this because the body is decomposing, but the key people that are supposed to arrive haven't come. Well, why are those key people? Why are they supposed to arrive? What does that relationship mean? And why are they waiting? See, those are the things that you have to understand. And if you process those things, then you begin to understand what are the significant issues for people in the culture. And that's really what this stuff is about tonight. Now, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and have James come up and talk about this map that he made. James, why don't you put in your microphone? You're going to need that, and I'll move this podium out of the way, and you can just walk over there by the map and tell us a little bit about what you thought was important about that map, why you created it.
I created this map because it is important. It gives you an understanding of my father, who was Mbuva, and myself, and our family as a whole. And the dotted lines here signify the boundary. This is the boundary, and it goes all around there. And this one here is road, and it goes through our land. And down here there is the river, known as Kademboni River. There is Ivembo here. Ivembo means a shrine, an old shrine where they used to worship and sacrifice. In fact, when I was a little boy, they used to sacrifice here, but I lacked a space here. I did not put it there. And again, I bought the area so as to destroy that kind of work there, because if it is my area, then the community will not have room, because I'm a Christian and also a pastor. And so if it is my land, that is not theirs. So I bought it, and I did not put it there. I lacked space, but very important area. Now, this valley is very important because along it, it's very fertile. And we have grazing areas. And my father is a cattle keeper. He likes raising cows. and African bulls and sheep. And that is how he terms his wealth, by the animals, by the land. And he has a bigger land than anybody here in the community. These are his step brothers, Mutunga and Chungu, but they have a smaller land because my father bought land up here where my mother is, because this is the territory of my mother, and this is the living room of my mother and the master bedroom of my mother, and this is kitchen here, and the rest is living room. We normally have many visitors coming, so they need a bigger room to stay when they are taking tea and another kind of food. And down here, if you look at this place, my father did not want to mix these two women together. I mean, to bring them close. He wanted to put them aside in order to curb quarreling and fighting. So this one is here, Kavele, and Guy is here, his first wife, who is my first mother. Now, so she can have her own garden here, and up here, this is a store. And this is a grazing area as well. And she can have her own cattle, her own sheep, but they belong to my father as well. But, and Kavele may have her own cows, sheep, and goats, but they belong to my father as well. But the kingdoms are divided. And I think he did that to have the right leadership in this case. Now, the house here is the house that belongs to Muli and Rhoda. Muli is me, and Rhoda is my wife. And understand, I'm saying Muli and Rhoda because this is a new kingdom altogether. This is Kavele's houses. This is Ngui's houses. That's how they define. Because they cannot say Mbuva. Because Mbuva is divided. He has two wives. So it is all Mbuva, but we distinguish each family by Kavele and Ngui. Okay. Even when they are dividing the land, they have two ways to go by the two wives, give the first wife a portion and give the second wife a portion. My father told me he will not divide the land that way. He will divide in accordance with his sons.
Let me make a couple of comments at this point, James.
Yes.
What James has given us now is not only the space, but the relationships. He's given us some of the people that are there, the connections between them, why the land is divided in particular kinds of ways. And so at this point, we don't have an event, we just have a map. And I'm going to ask him to tell you a story about that particular place and that map. Why don't we stop there for a minute, James? You can sit down here. You don't need to go back to the other seat. I'll just continue for a second or two.
Good.
On the subject of our discussion. As we look at our research activities then, one of the things I wanted to say to you is that when you select an event and you begin to define the social environment, then one of the things that you do is you do a map like this. The reason for this mapping is to basically help you to understand the space and the relationships between people in the space. The story that he's going to tell you will happen in this space. And so that will be something that, you know, all the space won't be there, but at least it gives you some idea and understanding. And James will then reference that as he tells the story. But once you get that, you begin to know the materials that are used by people. That may not seem important to you, but resources are a very, very important part of people's lives. And they fight over resources. They have wars over resources. There is deep conflict that happens over resources, and if you don't know the resource base upon which people are living and working, you won't really understand the tensions that come into their lives and why resources are an important part of that tension. Power really is related to the control of resources. And so what a map does, it gives you a sense of who defines this as my space. James already gave that to us. He told us that certain parts of this map, certain parts of this space belong to Kavela, his mother. Other parts of this space belong to Ngui, his father's first wife. And there was a reason that he gave, right? Okay, what was the reason? To prevent quarreling, because there would be tension over resources between these two women. And this is an issue that the father recognized and dealt with in terms of managing his resources. So that's why just mapping is an important way to get at resource base. It gives you an understanding of who defines what. There are some questions that we'll look at later in this semester in terms of how people actually conceptualize space, what values they place on space, whether they define it as public or private. That will be something that we come to as we go further. But just doing this little mapping exercise is always a tool that you can use to help you to dig deeper, to find things that you wouldn't otherwise. That's why when I was sitting in that funeral, I sketched out what was happening where. And then I could ask questions later about, well, why'd they go over here? Why'd they go down to that house down there? Because I remembered having done all that with a little tiny map on the paper I was working on. The other thing I want to suggest to you is that you do a calendar of the activity. Just as I did with the funeral, figure out what happened when it started, what were the sequence of things that goes through it. Even if you don't know and you don't understand it, if you just keep a record, this happened first, this happened second, this happened third, this happened at sunset, this happened after dark, this happened in the morning, and you basically build yourself a schedule, a calendar of the event that's going on. That will be helpful to you in terms of understanding and processing. Two very simple-minded things, and you don't realize how much they're a part of your ordinary life. Every time you go to church, you want a schedule. We call it a bulletin, you know. And if there is no bulletin, people say, well, where's the bulletin? You know? And hey, they didn't tell us what's going to happen today. The people in my church always complain if there's the bulletin doesn't have the order of service in it, because they kind of like to know what's going on. People always have a calendar. They may not write it down, but they know in their minds what's going to happen. They have a sense of how it ought to happen. They have a sense of the time in which it should occur. So these are important issues. Now, in looking at them, I've put in the bottom of the page 30 on the syllabus some questions. Questions that I think will be useful to you as you start working with your informant. These are questions, I call them questions for writing. You know, the first one obviously is what will you research and what's its location? You know, if you're going to research a funeral, then where did it happen? If you're going to research a farming activity, where did it happen? If you're going to research a schooling event, well, let's define the school. Who are the players and the spectators? What are the typical activities that happen there? We could ask James this. We already know Kavele and Guy are part of the players. Buva is a player. He said Muli and Rhoda are part of the players. So we already know some of the players on this map that he's created for us. Now the next question I'm going to ask him is to tell us about something significant that happened to him when he was living here, and tell us the story of that. Then we'll come back and we'll process that story. We'll try to fill in some of the things that we have had to do before. A few other questions here. What are the relationships and rules? What are the features and what are the activities held? They're basically not difficult questions. They're fairly simple-minded, actually, but we often don't ask them. We just forget to ask them, and in forgetting to ask them, we don't really dig deeper into the things that are happening. Okay, James, let's go on, and we'll get you to tell your story, and then we'll come back and try to analyze it in reference to interest.
Correct. This is like my mother's first house. It was built in the 60s, and the bricks are durable. We had a wall here that divided this place. So she had to go to our bedroom, which belongs to her and my mother, and my father as well. And here is where I was sleeping. I was sleeping here. I had a bed here. And this WW is window. Wherever you find WW is window. And what that means is I slept there, and the window became known as Molly's window. Molly's window. You would hear them, and I will come second, you know, go and take such and such from the window of Molly. And one time when I was here, I told you we normally have people coming in for a cup of tea in the morning because, as you can see, we have many cows. We have many cows because of the grazing. And so we have milk. So people come in the morning, we cook tea, and they share. And one woman came that belongs to Mutunga, Mutunga's first wife. He has two wives as well. Mutunga's first wife, who was married when I was born. No, before. She was married before. She was married after I was born. So she does not have the authenticity or the authority of coming and to speak words to me. She needs to honor me. But she is such a woman that is very authoritative. She came in one morning and looked into me in the eyes. I think I was 15 or 14, and said, Molly, why are you here? Why are you still in this house? Why do you want to stay here? What are you listening here? This house belongs to your mother and father. Why are you here? I didn't know whether they arranged this with my mother or something, but that did me bad because I knew she was telling me, move out. This is the time to move out. So when I moved out, I came down here and created my own one big room. And I told my father I need a house. And so he told me, make the bricks, and I will call the mason and people that can put the roof. I did my part. My father brought the mason. He paid him, and I had my own room. So I moved to this place. Were it not for this woman by the name Melly, I would not have moved. Now, it was out of this, when I grew up to a point of marriage, I asked my father, where do I erect my house? Because everything belongs to him. He told me, my son, build here. Bring your house up here. And that's where I came to build here, this modern house. This is a very modern house, a very good one. And you can see master bedroom, children room. I knew we were going to have many children. Children room 4, children room, children room. This is guest room. I was not able to do that, but I can do now. Guest room. Now, and this is a big, because I was thinking church, this is a big living room where we can hold at least 100 people if the churches are closed. So that is that. But this woman gave me new optics, new insights. And it was out of that I began to think of building my own house. And I knew right now I better grow up because I don't want to be embarrassed. She embarrassed me that morning. This woman did me something terrible. But she made me become a man and began to think about erecting my own house. And in that way, I had my own house. And this little house I gave my brother until a very big rain came and broke it down. And my father, my brother told me, my house is gone because what we do, even clothes, we share clothes. Clothes that do not fit me, I give to my brother. This house was very little for me. I gave it to my brother, and I came into this house. Now that I came to America, I also wrote him and told him, I give you this house as well. So I gave him this house. If we go there, we will have to look at a new place of residence. But the most impressive thing here is when my wife was married, we had no right to have a kitchen. If you look at this place, no kitchen. And that is because my wife is the first wife in our family, and she is supposed to be cooking with my mother. So I talked to my mother before we married. I asked her, my mother, I'm going to marry, and I know women fight. Now, tell me, if you hurt my wife, you are hurting me. Do you understand that, my mother, Kabele? She said, yes, I understand. What will you do? She told me, my son, if you bring a new wife here, I am going to give her the authority in the kitchen, because in Africa, kitchen is the most dominant place where women express power. There's no other place. Power over resources, cooking, and even the distribution of food. And if I come inside here, I'll be asked, what are you doing here? Get out of here. So, but I was concerned about my wife because I was excited about marriage. I've seen women, I've seen mother-in-law quarrel with their daughters. Some mother-in-laws sent their daughters away when the man is working in Nairobi or when he had gone for a trip. He comes home, he finds nobody there. His wife is gone. But I was concerned. I'm the first son there. My mother told me, do not worry, I will give her authority. And I watched to see if that is true. When I married, my mother gave my wife kitchen, and my mother used to sit somewhere there and watch. Now, my wife is generous. She involved her in the cooking, and they began to cook together. They began to cook together. And my mother began to teach my wife, when you see your father coming down here from Guy's house, begin cooking for him. Because by the time he arrives here, if there is no food, he will go. So when he gets a seat outside, normally men sit outside, you give him a cup of water first, you give him some tea, but you give him food right away. And that's the way my father works. And she learned from my mother. So, but if my brother marries, a new wife is coming, no fighting, my mother tells my wife, now you will graduate, go and erect your own kitchen somewhere here. And I had begun to think of a place somewhere here before I came to the United States of America. Yeah, but that is how it goes. And
that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that story. Okay, let's process this a little bit. I'll pull this back here. If you want to just sit down there, James, that'd be great.
yes.
In terms of thinking about this story, one of the things that I have noted up here is that we're looking at the subject of interest. Now, interest is a part of every human activity. And one of the things that I want to do in defining interest is interest always occurs in relationship. Okay? That you might say, well, I have my own personal interest. But I have wants as a person. But we define interest as those wants that involve other people, that they involve our relationships with other people. They're a part of the way people engage in interaction with one another to accomplish certain kinds of things that they desire. It's helpful if we give it that technical definition, because then if you think about interest, and we think we're going to try to understand what is important about James and his relationship to his mother, his relationship to the woman who came and said to him, what are you doing here? Why don't you get out? There is some interest involved there. What's happening? Why do they respond in the way they do? And that's what we're really looking at. Now, I'm going to go through some technical discussion of interest here for a few minutes, and we'll keep reflecting back on this story to try to help make sense of this story and what it means. The first thing that we want to talk about is capability. The notion here is could have. Okay? James could have stayed on his bed and said, well, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. I don't have any place to go. And I don't have any house to go to. And so James could have just taken the feedback that he got from his aunt and done nothing about it. He could have just stayed there. But he didn't. You know, he did something different. Now the question would be, why did he act in this other way? Why did he feel the need to get up and go out and start making bricks? You know, what was he feeling in his mind, in his heart, about the words that were spoken to him, and what motivated him in that particular way? We have a later part of the story. His brother is now staying in the house that James built. The house is destroyed by the water. And his brother says, James, my house is gone. Why didn't James tell him? You know how to build a house. I built one. We don't know that. We should find out. We should ask that question. What happened to James and what happened to his brother? Why did they interact differently and connect differently to those two issues? Now, James, would you like to comment on that?
Yes. The relationship that we have, particularly in our setting, is one that since I'm the oldest son in that family, I have a leadership role to give to my brothers and even the rest of the children. And even my coming to United States was very timely, that I had educated him to the university level. And so he was going to be responsible to take care of my parents when I am gone. And that was part of the deal. My father wanted him to pay me hard cash. And I told my father, no, I want my brother to be able to do what I did. And if he can buy you a packet of sugar, that would be a good payment. So if he may transfer that money or resources to you, it would be like me doing it. When the house that I had built and he was living in it was destroyed by water, the monsoon winds and big rain, he did not go to his father to say, my father, the house that I was living in is gone. He came to me and he told me the house is gone. And in fact, what I did was I gave him to live here. If I may cross here briefly, I gave him to come and live here. He was living there.
In the children's room.
Yeah, and by then we had no children, not many. They were living here.
Okay.
Okay. So what happened was I still am the firstborn. I still am that big brother. And it is like he looks up to me for counsel and for anything else. Now, when I came here and the house was going to be empty, although my father took a lot of pride in it and he began to challenge the children, will you build a house for me as big as this one? Because this is like his property. And he said, my first son did me good. He also married so well. Are you going to do this? And so when we came here, I had to tell my brother, hey, these are material things. We are not using it. My parents cannot use it. Come and use it. Even if you want to marry there.
Okay. All right, good. This now has given us much more meaning, you see. Just by looking at, well, why did he do this? Why couldn't he have done something else? You've got now an understanding about leadership that we didn't have when the story was told. You have a sense of the relationship between the elder brother and younger brother that we didn't have when the story was told. And we're filling in some of the deeper meaning that's part of his understanding of how people ought to live and relate to one another in this context. That's my point. As we dig into this, we begin to ask the question, well, could they have done something different? Why didn't they do it? Look at what his brother did, why he did it. You then begin to fill in the expectations. We're now beginning to understand something of the structure of the family. You could right now begin a hypothesis of the structure of relationships in this family. You could look at who is the senior person. That's clearly Mbuva. But there's clearly now a second leadership. We also have an idea that the reason that James responded the way he did when he was in his room and his aunt came was because she was challenging him to become the leader that he was supposed to become. And so you see that there is social expectation in the community, and this aunt was the agent of voicing that expectation and motivating James to begin to take his responsible role as a young man.
And in fact, when I took that step of erecting a house, she mobilized the women in the community to come and bring water and to come and thatch the house.
Okay, fantastic. So she then became a partner with you in the process. That brings up my next point, and that is what we call knowledgeability. All the members in the society know these things we've been talking about. You see, James's aunt knows the rules. His father and mother know the rules. His father's brothers know the rules. They know what's expected of elder sons. And so they've probably been discussing this and talking about it. They might have even said, well, why don't you do this? Yeah. You go confront James someday.
They're the kid.
Yeah, and there's this process of conversation going on. People know what's expected, you see. They have understandings of these social activities. They know the conditions that are part of people's lives, and they know how to prompt people to achieve the things they need to achieve. So this moment that James has described to us was a very significant moment in his life. He's never forgotten it. You know, the first time he took this class from me, I just, by chance, asked him to come up one night and tell a story. And this is the story that jumped right out in his mind. It was one that he just has not forgotten, because it was a defining moment of his leadership in this family.
And maturation as well.
Yeah, of maturation. It becoming what he was expected to become. So, yes?
Does that mean that your aunt was really looking out for you? What she said was not an insult, right?
If you remember what I said last week is that my name is Molly. That is because it is like I was forgotten somewhere in the womb. Because the women that were married there by my uncles gave birth to girls. to females. And I came as a hope for the whole family of my grandfather. And everybody is looking at me. Everybody's looking at me. When is this young man going to move? When is he going to begin to be that person we want him to be? Because I was not only going to be the leader for Kavele and Gi, but also for these other people around our community.
Okay. All right, I want to just identify a couple of things. What we're talking about here now is what we're calling practical consciousness. And I want to make this just brief observation, because this is what James is thinking and seeing and understanding in his practical consciousness. In other words, he's interpreting and explaining his world to you in his understanding. And this is how the people are engaging in their relationships. There's part of life that we call the unconscious. And I've noted here that we don't study that in this course. That's not part of our subject matter. Not because that's not important, but because I'm not an expert in that area, and it's not something that we're going to focus on in this class. That's something that Marcy's focusing on as she's doing her preparation for a doctorate in psychology. And she'll be looking at that part of human motivation and behavior. We recognize that's a very important part of human behavior. And we understand that people oftentimes do things out of their unconscious motivations as well as out of their conscious ones. What we're dealing with in this course and in this particular discussion tonight are the things that people do because they understand what's going on around them. They explain it through certain kind of cultural concepts, and they act on the basis of those explanations to do what they do. Now, James is probably motivated by some unconscious things as well, and we really won't be exploring those. We won't have any way to understand them even by the end of the semester. And yet, that may be an important part of your understanding their culture. One of my Doctor of Missiology students in this program is really concerned about that issue with regard to an African indigenous church. He has had a rather extensive relationship with one of the founder of this African indigenous church. And my colleague is convinced that part of the reasons that this church was founded and the theology of this man has taken a twist which we would consider heretical theology is because of unconscious motivations in his culture and in his life. And so this man's dissertation will be focusing on the interplay between the conscious and the unconscious. Some of you may be interested in that. Gary Burlington has chosen that as his doctoral thesis, and that's the subject he wants to work on. Now for him, he has to do this work to understand the conscious culture and understand the rules that are happening at that level, but to understand aberrant theology, he's looking at issues that are deeper in the subconscious. For example, this particular church defines God as God as Mother, Father, and Mary and Jesus as being co-equals, and the Holy Spirit as being the fifth person of the divinity. In other words, instead of Trinity, there are five in this particular African theology. Well, why? Well, you can look at some of the practical aspects of the culture at the conscious level, but Gary Burlington feels that to get at that, he has to go to the unconscious as well, to understand it from the perspective of what's driving this man inside. And his life story is the first part at getting at that, to see some of the conflicts that he had. For example, his father abandoned him when he was a child. His mother then was in situations which were created a great deal of crisis for her. And so his mother, in a real sense, is kind of a salvation personality toward him. And the father is an ambiguous personality that he has a very difficult time relating to. Here we can see James having a very positive relationship with his father, a very positive relationship with his mother, even a very positive relationship with his father's first wife. And so we see the dynamics of this family setting, as we've heard the story, as being a healthy family, a family in which people are respected and loved with one another. And so looking at the subconscious dimensions of what happened in James's growing up, we don't find real substantive conflicts there that have at least obviously affected his response to the gospel, his response to his parents, his response to the wider culture. I don't want to go into that in any depth because I just want to introduce that and let you know this is an important subject, but it's not a part of our topic tonight, not because it's important, but because we aren't able to work on it. Now the next thing I want to look at is the issue of wants. What do people want? Wants are always an important part of the interest. They're the basis of interest. And when wants involve other people, then they become what we call interest relationships. Again, in your outline, I've talked about interest as being objective, to be aware of what one wants and to know how to go get it. In other words, in this situation, in this story, James's aunt wanted James to mature. And that's a social want. In other words, it has to do with relationships. She's watching this young man. She's seeing, you know, he's not taking his responsibility yet. And really the first step that he needs to take is to get out of here and build his own house. So she confronted him. Oh, in a friendly way, in a joking way, but it was a confrontation. He knew it. And it mobilized him. Now, what want did James have? He wanted a house, yes. But what else?
He wanted to mature, to take on that role of being a leader.
Exactly, he wanted to mature. And what did he expect back from his aunt?
Support?
Respect.
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 Respect, that's exactly right. Don't you remember what he said? She's
Didn't mean bad.
supposed to respect me. That she was married after I was born. So in the whole authority structure of things, he gave us a clue there. And it was clear that she didn't respect him. So he's got to go out and earn that respect. So she wants him to mature. He wants to have her respect. And so in that relationship, both of them are motivated to do things. Now, how did she show his respect for him? Her respect for him.
She
Okay?
helped him out when he needed to build material.
Okay, that's exactly right. She came with other women and helped him out. And that was an important step then in her affirming what he was doing and saying, yes, that's right, James. So we have that kind of objective interest to know what you want and to know how to go about obtaining it. James knew what to do. Same day, right?
Yes.
What did you do that day?
Well, I went into the fields and I cut logs.
Okay.
I remember I cut 15 logs.
Okay.
And the following day, and because my father had oxen, I went and tied them and went and pulled them to the place down there. And the following day, I went to looking for sisal fibers, big sisal fibers that were going to be like roof. And I moved. Within 3 weeks, I had materials there, and we were moving strongly.
Okay.
But then when my father came, he told me, this is a good step, but you need bricks, not logs. Oh.
Okay, now that brings us, great, James, to the next thing. That you see the father now brings in the family and the family expectations, what we call the collective interest.
Yes.
There are other people involved. Other people have standards. James, this has to be done to a proper standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what was the father's comment about the proper standard?
The proper standard was you need to have a house built of bricks. So these logs are good, just keep them there, but now begin to erect bricks, and that's it. And since he said that, I began to think about brick, and I went to the area, dug an area, began to bring water, and that is when Melly, my aunt, mobilized other women and said, behold, the young man has waken up, so we are going to support him. And that's when they brought water, and they came and helped in kind of treading on the mud so that it may be good enough to make bricks that are strong.
Okay, good. We have about 5 minutes left in this hour, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential courses of action that are another part of this. You know, James started with one course of action. Okay, he knew to build a house he needed some logs, so he began that and he went out to do it. But he found out that that wasn't acceptable to his father, that he needed to do something that was better in action. So there was more than one way to build a house. There were two different courses of action that he could have taken at least in this context. And again, that's what you often find with people. There are many courses of action that people can take. There are many ways that they can go about finding their interest. And so what you want to look at is what are the potential courses of action, which one was chosen, why was the one affirmed, the other one rejected. That becomes an important part, again, of understanding the motivations that are behind people's thoughts and actions. One other thing that I want to talk about here and a little bit as we conclude this section, actions presupposes institutions. Now, what do I mean by institutions? In this context, the institution is the family. Here you have an extended family, a polygamous extended family. You have the father, who is the head of the family. You have his 2 wives. You also have younger brothers living nearby. Over here on the outside of the map, you have the 2 younger brothers with their wives and their children. And so you have this extended family group. This is the institutional context that we have here. In a society like the one James is working in, the interests that people have are based upon their social institutions. And the family is clearly a key important social institution for his work. Now, one of the things that I want to mention about the structure is that structure I will define briefly as that which is out of control. Now, I'll come back to this in the next hour, but when I mean structure is out of control, what I mean by that is that the structure itself is something that James can't change, that he can't manipulate it, that it's already there. For example, the authority of his father, the relationships of his father and his wives, the relationship between his father and his uncles. All of that is really out of James' control. James is an actor within that situation, and he has to respond in the context of structure. And I want you to think about structure like this for just a few minutes to focus on the fact that when we have social structures, those are things that people don't change. They're things that to them are fixed, and they don't control them. They act in response to them. That's why we're trying to understand social structure, so that we can know how it works. There are always rules about social structure. There are always resources that are part of social structure, and that's a very important part of our understanding. Obviously, James's father had some particular value in mind and some particular standard in mind when it came to building that house. That's why he rejected the logs as the appropriate resource. He said the right resource are the bricks. And so this particular structural solution was part of the father's interpretation of how the structure should be applied in James's case for this situation. There are also institutional practices, and these are things that are part of the family and how this family works. I'm sure James could tell us stories about other family institutions where people didn't live up to the standards, where the father didn't have the respect and honor that his father had in the community, where aunts didn't play the roles of challenging their nephews to behaving properly and to becoming mature young people, where the family didn't function in the way that it functioned here, because families don't always work as well as this one. And this particular family was one where they practiced in certain kinds of ways that brought about certain results. Others could act differently. They could have the same kind of a family in a different place who processes these things in a different kind of way. So as we look at this whole analysis that we've described here, I want you to think about this in reference to the fact that people are dynamic. They have choices. And that in this, people aren't acting as robots. They're thinking, creative, acting people. They have choices within the context. They're institutions, but those institutions set parameters and don't define how I live. How I act is on the basis of what is acceptable, but also on the basis of what I want. Now, as you think about your research project, one of the things that you'll be trying to do with your informant is to understand how they think and how they work within a context, and try to understand whether they are acting in accord with principles they think are critical principles, whether they're deviating from those principles, whether the people they are interacting with in their social institution are the people they admire and respect, or if they're frustrated and discouraged because their father didn't act properly, their mother didn't act properly, or somebody else failed to fulfill an expectation. And the kind of case that we've dealt with tonight gives you some clues as to how to process that and the kind of areas to look at as we interact with people. Okay, we'll take a break, and we'll come back in 15 minutes to continue the session. Thank you. For our second lecture this evening and the fourth lecture in the series on social organization, we're going to be focusing on social events. As I mentioned in the first hour, we look at events as the key component for studying and understanding how cultures work. When you look at social events, there are some specific tools that are helpful to be able to do a better job on this. And so what I want to do in this first part of the lecture is to focus on those tools. The material that I have to share with you comes from an article actually by Charles Frake looking at the analysis of a religious event in a particular community of people in the Philippines called the Subanan. The article is one that I think is listed in your syllabus, but if it's not, if you have an interest in that, I can give you the reference. When we think about social events, we're really talking about, again, social activities, as we discussed in our first lecture. And those activities cover a wide range of possibilities. For example, eating is a social activity. And we just had a little food in our break. How you talked to each other when you ate, what happened with the food, in other words, who brought it, what are the rules about bringing food. We made you sign up at the break so that you could bring some food yourselves in the next few weeks. So we've organized the eating process. Everybody organizes eating. Every culture you look at has some particular organization about eating. And so I find that is one of the most interesting things to study. In fact, the second thing, in fact, eating is even more important than funerals because they eat at funerals and they eat every day. You know funerals are always going to happen, but eating is something that happens daily. And when it's social eating, in other words, when it's not people eating alone, it happens in a social context. Then there are important social things that go on. And how people organize that often gives you an understanding of the culture. In a book that I published earlier called Transforming Culture, I actually had a chapter on eating as a window into social relationships because I believe that the public eating practices of people can be very, very useful in understanding the structure of the culture. You remember last week I talked about having a big feast for the Yapese people, and all the men were on one side of the road and the women and the children were on the other side of the road, because in their culture the women and the men don't eat together. It's always a separate function. And the women and children eat together, but the men have a separate time and a separate place. I was in Africa back in 1978, and I ate for 2 weeks. I ate with an African family. Now that was a very interesting experience because I say I ate with a family, but I never did. I always ate with the man of the house. And I never had any encounter with the women or the children because the women and children always ate in the kitchen, and the food was always brought in for the head of the house and myself in his special room, at his special table, with his special dishes. And so it was a process in which we had, that was the structure that was handled in that case. Now, that's quite a contrast to what I grew up with, where we always sat at the table. My father sat at the head, my mother sat in the chair closest to the kitchen, and the rest of us sat at other places in the table. And you could go into the houses of my aunts and uncles and all of my relatives and find exactly the same seating structure. The woman was always closest to the kitchen, father was always at the head of the table, and the others were whatever space was left. Well, people always organize their eating practices on the basis of their culture. Working also involves the structure and organization of life. And learning, a learning context. How do people learn? You remember last week we asked James, how did he learn to make the beehive? Well, he watched. There was no lectures. There was no, well, I'll show you how to do it. He just watched. And then one day he said, I'm going to make a beehive. And he'd watched long enough and learned so that he knew how to do it without any formal instruction at all. For us, formal instruction is a way we always look to learn. We expect somebody to teach us. It's a different culture, a different way of thinking. Leadership is another kind of social activity. How people organize their leadership. What are the leadership events that occur? And how does this work? The story that James told us in the first hour was actually a story in the development of family leadership. It was a story where an aunt confronted the nephew and said, "You're irresponsible. You're old enough to do something about it. Get to work." And so he did. Now, that was not just an event about building a house and about getting a young man out into his own house. It was really a story about teaching a young man how to be the leader in the family because that was his role. That's where he was going. Decision making is another key thing. A little bit further on in the class, we're going to find out how the decision was made for James to marry Rhoda. What is the decision-making process? Studying that event, how was that decided, be a very important issue. Decision-making is a key thing to look at. Disputes. One of the most important kinds of things that you can study is the conflicts that happen between people. Getting information about a dispute, it's the best data to have. When I was working with Gordon Coop with the Wycliffe Bible translators down in Peru, actually in Brazil, near Peru, in the upper Purus River region, we were there, I was actually there just for 2 days, and I was awakened very early in the morning by shouting. And I thought the guy was shouting in my house. We were just in this village out in the middle of a jungle clearing. The trees are 200 feet high, and the houses are in stilts up off the ground, and there's hardly any walls on them. In fact, most of it's just thatch. And I'm lying in my house at 4 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden this shouting is going on. What in the world is happening? I sat up in my hammock. I looked all around. It was pitch black, and there's this ongoing shouting right next to me. Well, it was the man in the house right next to me. He wasn't in my house. And he went on and on and on. And then after a while he stopped, and somebody answered across the village, and they then were talking back and forth. And this went on for maybe a half an hour. You know, people engaged in this conversation in what to me was the middle of the night. Well, they went to bed at 8 o'clock. 4 o'clock in the morning, they were awake, and they were having a meeting. And it wasn't a happy meeting. They were complaining. They were complaining about people and what was going on. I didn't know that. So I got out to breakfast, and I said to my friend Gordon, I said, what was going on at 4 o'clock this morning? He said, oh, I don't know. I said, well, the guy was shouting right in my house. He said, oh, I sleep through that now. I used to wake up for that, but I ignore it. I said, Gordon, you can't ignore it. You got to find out what's going on. He says, well, I don't like to be involved in their gossip. I said, this is not gossip. This is social action. We have to find out what's going on. So he asked. Well, it was very, very interesting because the guy was yelling at the women. He was saying, you women are lazy. You're always coming around to my house asking me for my black glue. You can go get your own black glue. You're just lazy. You can take care of yourself. Stop asking me for this stuff. And then he said, you're always coming and asking my wife for meat. You know how to fish. Go out and get your own fish. Quit coming around and begging for me. And he went on and on. The guy who spoke further was saying, yeah, I agree. I'm tired of you coming to my house and asking me for my black glue. And so it went back and forth. Well, there were obviously some problems in the village. So I said, well, why are they complaining like this? Well, their husbands are away. They're working for Brazilians. And the women don't have any man to go get them black glue or help get them meat. And so they're coming and asking for meat and for these things from another family in the community. And the people are tired of it. They don't like it. Well, these particular Indian are very individualistic. They think everybody should be self-sufficient. Everybody should do their own thing for themselves. And if you don't, well, you're a beggar, and they don't like it. And so they were voicing their complaints at that particular time. That really helped us to begin to understand their culture. You see, by looking at what they are angry about, you begin to understand what they value. And we discovered they valued every individual doing his own hard work. Everybody out there making their own way, and don't come depend upon me all the time. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't share, but they were tired of it. In other words, for them, you're just asking too much. You can do these things yourselves, and you're lazy, and you should be working. So disputing or how disputes are settled are very important parts of cultural process. Now, if you want to get some good data from someone that you're interviewing, one of the things to do is find out about a conflict that they've been involved in. And it will give you insights into the deeper values that those people have. It will just give you a rich source of data. Whatever you look at, there are many of these things. Rituals are, of course, a part of events. Ceremony is another part of events. All of these kind of social activities are excellent sources of data that will help you to get deeper insight into a culture. Now, once you have identified the activity, why do you study it, and what are your goals in terms of looking at it? One of the first things, it's always for understanding. What we're really trying to do is to know how people interpret and explain what they do. See, the process is always one of getting into their minds, of understanding their worldview, of being able to connect with them, be able to communicate to them about things that are of value to them. So you want to understand how the culture works. You want to know basically the process of communication that is involved with people. And these kind of activities help you, the study of these kinds of activities help you to get into how it works and how communication happens. Now, earlier, before we actually began the lectures in our informal session at the beginning of class, I asked you what some of your particular mission goals were. And some of you have an interest in working in a place like China, for example, a very complex nation with many, many different languages and ethnic groups, many different cultures. China is not a monolithic place. It's a very diverse place. It has many, many hundreds of cultures, actually, and they operate in very different kinds of ways. Some of you are interested in Indonesia. Some of you are interested in Africa. Some of you are interested in America and the complex cross-cultural things that are happening here in America. Well, if we look at social events in any of these kinds of things, you can begin to understand how the people themselves define their world, the parameters they set for proper and improper behavior, and then how they play the game. And that really is what we're out to understand, how they play the game. If you can think about it in a game analogy, you can take a sport like American football. American football has certain kind of rules and certain kinds of procedures, but every team plays the game differently. You have the San Francisco 49ers giving a little bit of a different twist to it from the Green Bay Packers. And they try to be different enough that the other team can't figure them out. And they work hard at that to create this complex playing of the game in such a way that they not only can outplay the other team, but they can win the game. Well, if you think about culture like this, culture has certain kinds of rules. There's a game that people play. But they play it so that their family wins. They play it so that their group wins. They play it so that their community has the best advantage that they can get for their community. And so if we're looking at how they actually play the game, it helps us to actually get into the game itself and begin to try to understand how it works. There are some theoretical questions that we're going to look at to help us in this process. And then once we get through the theoretical questions, we'll come to the case study of Ruth. The first thing that we're looking at is, if you're studying a culture and you're a new person there, what would you consider to be the major events? When I went into this culture down in Suriname in South America, and I happened there on the day of a funeral, it was very clear to me at that particular point in time, this was a major event. This was something that everybody gathered for. This was something that was very important to the whole community and to people in other communities. And it was a key focal point for that particular culture. I would ask the next question, what are some of the other major events in this culture? Things that people here think are very, very important. And we could then decide which of these we wanted to study and how we wanted to approach them. When you identify an event that you're going to look at, then what you want to ask is, what are the observed interactions? This is making the list that I told you about when I went into the funeral, setting down the observed interactions that were happening there. What did people actually do? When I was at that funeral, one of the things that I'll never forget was at a particular time in the funeral, two men picked up this great big coffin. And they put it up on their heads. And then they walked around through the village with the coffin. And I said, what's going on? I said, well, they're waiting for the coffin to speak. And as they walked around with the coffin like this, and they would walk towards someone, all of a sudden it would go like that. And oh, the coffin spoke. And then they would walk around further, and they would go on to some other place. And then they would go, oh, and the coffin spoke. Well, there was a process here of divining. Who are the people that may have been involved in causing this death? And the coffin speaking was this divining process, this ritual that they were going through to try to capture the essence of the cause of the death of the person that was there. Now, I'd never seen anything like that before, but that was an act that was there. The coffin was a key part of that. And that was apparently a part of every funeral. Well, we'd want to know what's going on. We want to get a deeper explanation of that particular. I saw it, I didn't understand it until we followed up the next day and we asked somebody who explained to us the kind of things that are going on. Another general question, a broad view, is how does this specific event relate to other events? In other words, this is a particular moment, the funeral. How does it relate to marriage? How does it relate to birth? How does it relate to annual ritual ceremonies? Is there any connection at all? What is the total complex of things that fit together in the society? So these are kind of general overall issues that you want to understand. What are the things that properly belong here? How does this relate to other scenes? How does it fit into the whole picture of the culture? In thinking about the story that James told us earlier, one of the things that we might want to look at is what are the key moments in the life of the firstborn son in a family? And look at how they occur in the life of the family. What would the family say? This is a key moment. This is a key moment. And we could ask James that question. It won't take time to do it tonight, but you might think about that, James, and we might come back to that later on. What are the key moments in the life of the firstborn child? And if we then looked at that, we'd probably find that there are a number of things that would happen, and that would give us an understanding of how the families institutionally try to develop the leadership of the firstborn in that context. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is the context of an event itself. What really happens in the situation? And again, I'm going to give you just 5 basic categories here of things to look for. And all I'm really doing is setting forth a theoretical framework for analysis. Once you get a story, you have to figure out how to understand its meaning. And you want to make sure you have enough details. And so the details of the story, what are the details that you want to get? That's what I'm going to talk to you about here. The first thing is the settings. In our class this evening, we had a map. Okay? And that map really helped us to explain certain things about the story. That's part of the setting. We have the syllabus that you're working with. That's part of the setting. We have the readings that you had to do. That's part of the setting. We come to this classroom, and now we're sitting here together, and I'm lecturing, and you're taking notes. It's all part of the setting. So in this particular place, we have seats. We have a podium. Again, that's part of the setting. Every situation we're in has the components of a setting. And so we want to, what is the stage, if you will? What's the arena in which things happen? And that's really what we talked about before when we drew the map. What are the provisions that are needed there? It's interesting that, if you're going to have a funeral, you have to have a body. I mean, that's the first basic thing about a funeral. Then probably you have a coffin, but not necessarily. Some people buried in mats. Other people would bury in a jar. And so it depends on the culture, it depends on the place as to what the burial would be like. Other places, the body is cremated, so there would be no burial instruments at all. In fact, there is a film on the Grand Valley Donny which shows that the deceased is placed in a chair and then displayed in the public in a chair until the time for the actual cremation to occur. And then the body is placed on a large pile of logs, and then the body is burned. And everybody then is there for the burning moment, and it's a part of imparting the spirit into the afterlife. So each culture is different in terms of how this process occurs. What are the provisions that basically are needed for that? The other provisions is kind of a category that you may need food, you may need money. For example, if I attended a funeral in Yap, one of the things that people did is they always brought money, or they brought cigarettes, or they brought food, some kind of gift to the family. These things were all distributed, or they were used to purchase things for the family. The gifts were part of the provisions to make sure that the funeral could happen. Paraphernalia is a word that is used for some more technical things having to do with the specific requirements for a particular event to happen, oftentimes a ritual event. For example, we could technically say that the syllabus is paraphernalia. You have to have a syllabus for a class with some outlines and notes. It's part of the technical requirements to do the task here. The textbooks are paraphernalia in that particular term. There's something essential to the study. So if you're looking at let's say that somebody has to do a purifying ritual, in a particular place. There would be certain herbs, there would be certain kinds of bowls that might be needed to basically do that particular ritual process. So in this situation, the article that comes from Frake, it was on religious behavior, and religious behavior always requires certain kinds of paraphernalia as part of it. For example, you go to church, there's a pulpit, okay? And if you're going to have baptism, there has to be a baptistry or a baptismal urn. If you're going to have communion, you have to have then the bread and the cup, and you have to have the wine for the cup. And so those are what we call the paraphernalia, the things that are essential for actually the thing to occur. Of course, the participants are key. You know, and again, these are just basically part of the context, making sure that you've covered all your grounds. Do you know all the things that are needed? Who are the actors, and what are their roles? And then finally, you have the routines. What are the things that they actually go through when they go through this process? I described a routine of the divining of the coffin. In other words, when the coffin spoke, that was a routine that would happen at every one of those funerals. In the church, we have the routine of singing. We have the routine of taking the offering. We have the routine of welcoming the guests. We have the routine of the sermon. We have the routine of some kind of closure to the sermon. Those are parts of things that are part of the activities of an event as you look at it. All right, the context basically gives us the details of what goes on. But we want to go beyond that. We want to understand and interpret the context. And so we go to a number of other concepts. As we think about the story of Ruth, we're going to look at what I call the demands and constraints. Demands are oftentimes the social expectations that people have. In the story that James gave us, his aunt made a demand upon him. You know, James, you need to grow up. It's time. What are you doing sitting around here and being a little boy? James was angry at that, right, James? You know, hey, I'm not a little boy. That same day, he's out. I'm not a boy. I'm going to show him. So there was this pressure, you know. She was really pressuring him at that point, putting a social demand upon him. There are norms of behavior. What is the proper behavior for a young man? And so his aunt was saying, this is time. You need to grow up. Now is the time. You don't need to wait another day. Those are kind of things that are part of demands. There are also constraints. For example, when his father said, no, James, poles won't do. You have to use brick. You have to make bricks. So that's a constraint in the situation. And this is what we're looking at. We look at demands and constraints. What are the expectations that you must do? What are the things that you can't do? And how does the social framework define that for you? There are also sometimes limitations of an environment. The environment may not have certain kind of resources that people need. Or you're limited to the kind of resources that you use. One of the things that's happening all over the world, in Asia and Africa, is that the forests are being rapidly depleted by the activity of farming and by the activity of logging. So as people use firewood for fuel, it becomes harder and harder to get. And as firewood becomes harder and harder to get, then people are pushed to limit the amount of firewood they use. They have to go farther and further to get it. It creates hardships on them, and it really affects their whole lives. So in looking at just the fact that they cook with wood, the environment can create some significant constraints on how much you're going to use, when you use it, and how you go about it. Those are the kind of things that you look at, not just the social things, but they're also actually ecological and environmental things that constrain what people do. Another thing that we look at are the strategies. What kind of alternatives do people consider? How do they go about acting out with these alternatives? What options do they have? What options do they actually exercise? And we'll take a look at that when we get to the book of Ruth. Transactions is another term that you may or may not be familiar with. In looking at transactions, we're looking at the kind of exchanges that occur between people. I'll come back to the case of James's story earlier. When his aunt told him he should go out, he should get out of the house and build his own house, she basically rebuked him and motivated him to do something that he didn't think about before. Now, in this process, James acted on that social, verbal exchange, and he began to do the things that she expected. Now, she actually repaid him later by coming and helping him. It was a transaction of labor. In other words, she contributed her labor and brought her friends along to help in his labor so that he could complete this task. And so because James honored her by doing the thing that she asked, she then brought back to him help and the assistance of labor as part of this transaction between them. And this is what I mean by transaction. It's basically the exchanges that go on between people. You can have verbal transactions. You can have economic transactions. You can have labor transactions. You can have the transactions of value, things that we value in relationship to one another. And so those things can become a part of how we work and what we do. Finally, we have feedback. Feedback basically is the affirmation or the rebuke that you get in your relationships with people when you interact with them on these kind of issues. In this case, the feedback James got was very positive. When his aunt came to help him, how did you feel, James?
Good.
Okay. And what made you feel good?
Because she did not only send me out, she came to help me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did that say to you, not just about the help?
She accepted and honored me.
Okay. And see, that's an important value. The fact that she honored him, not just helping him, but honoring him in the process, you see, says more than just the material help. There was socially added value there, something that was significant in the relationship. So oftentimes missionaries who are working in cross-cultural contexts don't recognize what adds social value in their behaviors. They don't know that by just doing something that to them may seem very insignificant and unimportant, that they're honoring somebody, and they're not only offering maybe some assistance, but they're creating a socially added value that has very great significance for the people. And the only way we can learn where those socially added values come from is through really digging into the relationships and seeing how people themselves do it and what has value and meaning to them in this context. All right. A day in the life of Ruth. If you have your Bibles, you might want to follow with me in this. I'm going to read you the story again tonight. We're going to take Ruth chapter 2. And as we look at this chapter, I'm going to read through it quickly. But in the reading through it, I will be following on the screen, giving you again the literary structure. The first part of this chapter is to reflect again on the kind of structure that is part of the way the writer wrote it. And if you remember, we talked last week about chiastic structure. That means that the text takes a series of steps into the central meaning and then takes a series of parallel steps back out. In this one, as we go through it, you're going to find that Naomi and Ruth talk together, and then Boaz speaks, and then Ruth speaks, and then Boaz speaks, and then Ruth speaks, and then Boaz speaks, and then Naomi and Ruth talk together. It begins with one section and ends in the same way, and we go through that series of steps. I'll read the story. You can follow, and I'll be following as we go through the story on the screen. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in any other field. And don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you noticed me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord, she said. You've given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered. It amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she'd eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. She said, The Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, He even said to me, Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, as you see the literary text of the story, you see how the themes are repeated through the story. Those themes give us the first understanding to meaning. And this is one of the fascinating things about the Scriptures, because the Scriptures tell stories, but they tell them not just as telling the story, but the writers, inspired by the Holy Spirit, but working within their cultural context, told stories in ways that fit their pattern of teaching in their culture. And one of the things you see about the story, as we've looked at it yesterday and today, or last week and tonight, is that the central meaning of the story occurs in the center. And the central meaning focuses on God and the relationships of the people with God. Tonight, we have the Lord repay you for what you've done. Boaz looked at her and said, it's a marvel of what you've done for your mother-in-law. This is really something that's unheard of. And the Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, because this is a wonderful thing that you have done. Now, that theme is the theme that we see going through Ruth. Do you remember the central meaning last week was that the Lord is against me. And the Lord has departed from me, and I am just completely alone and distraught. Naomi said, I'm going back empty, and I'm bitter. That was the key part of the story. Tonight we see in the center of the story that the Lord is repaying goodness to Ruth and doing wonderful things because of what Ruth has done. And of course, through the story, we'll follow that as we work with it. Now, if we look at the story, let's analyze it. We'll take some of the basic things that we had earlier, and we'll follow through in the same kind of way. The first thing is the social structure of labor. Not a whole lot of detail here, but who are the players? I couldn't hear you.
The male workers.
Okay, the male workers. Who else?
Servant girls.
Okay, servant girls.
And then people who follow behind.
Okay, people who follow behind. There were people like Ruth. Okay, all right. Who else is the main player?
Boaz.
Boaz, good. Who else?
Naomi.
Naomi. And of course, Ruth. All right. Now, if we think about this, how are they related? It's one of our key questions. What are the relationships? If you remember the story, the very first sentence in this chapter says what?
He's there.
Boaz is?
Elimelech's clan.
Elimelech's clan. That's right. So the connection is established right off the bat. And at the end of the story, the connection is reaffirmed again. In the last verse, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Okay. So the kinship tie is right up front in the story. Very, very key part of the story. All right? What are the other relationships beside that?
Worker servant.
Okay, worker servants, that's right. Boaz comes out to the field. He's got clearly people who are loyal to him. And, how does he greet them?
The Lord be with you.
Okay, the Lord be with you. In other words, it's a very positive relationship as it comes across here. And it's kind of a joyful thing. Is there any organization of the workers? You're shaking your head, James. What is it?
Well, they had some people picking some water and the other people gleaning.
Okay. All right, there were certain responsibilities. Was anybody in charge?
Yeah. Well, there was a foreman.
Okay, there was a foreman. Good. All right. So we've got then an organization of labor. Now you see, when you read this before, you didn't even notice that. Okay? But it's important to understand that here's a social structure at work. Okay? It has an owner, Boaz. He's got a foreman of his workers. He's got people working under them, and both men and women servants working in this context. And then there are the gleaners that come along behind. So we have then some social structure. The people that are there have an ordered relationship to one another. There is this social situation in which there are key players, and they have already defined, well-defined relationships. All right. If we look at the implied eating customs, what regulations are implied by the eating customs here? And why does Boaz give special instructions to his men? You have to dig deep to get this now. What's happening here with eating?
Well, Ruth has to go pick her own food, it seems like.
Okay, Ruth has to pick her own food. What do you mean by that, John?
She has to go do the work of actually gathering her
Okay,
own food.
she has to gather the gleaning from the harvest, all right? But what else is going on here?
She's able to, she had to get permission to drink from the water with the men, and also being able to eat with them is.
Okay, the text really makes mention of this. So this must be something that's different. The text doesn't record things unless it's a significant part of the story. Okay, so why would this be significant? And we have to now here look. We can't interview Boaz. If we could interview him like we've interviewed James, it would be a lot easier. We can't interview him. So what can we find out just from the way that the story unfolds? If you look, for example, at what happens in verse 9, what does Boaz tell her?
Don't go anywhere else, just stay here.
Okay, don't go anywhere else. Just stay here, and I'll read it to you again. See, most of you don't have Bibles. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Okay? So what this tells you is that a gleaner would not have the right to go and drink their water. Okay? That she's being given permission to go and take water from a source that would not ordinarily be hers to take. Okay? That's an important thing. So that the provisions here are not public. It's not everybody can come in and wants a drink of water and get a drink out of the water. Boaz is just removing from her any constraints, saying, there's water here, and you may have it. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a wheat field, or a barley field, and you've been trying to harvest barley. It's a hot place. It's a burning up place, and you're following along behind the harvesters. You're going to get thirsty, mighty thirsty. And she'd have to stop and go get her own water, bring her own water. In this situation, she doesn't have to do that. She's given the privilege of taking from their water. They've actually filled it. And her response is one of, what wonderful favor that you've given to me. Now, the interesting thing, you go through the center of the text and come out on the other side, and Boaz deals with gleaning and eating again. The first time it's glean and drink. The second time it's glean and eat. And what does he do with her with regard to eating? At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar. Okay?
Wow.
The invitation to eat with Boaz.
Right. He even passes the bread to her, seems like himself.
That's right. He passes the bread to her. Exactly right. So you see, the Old Testament does not command this. Okay? This is not a requirement. If you go and take a look at what the law of gleaning is, and we can check this out, we'll look at it quickly. If you look at Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 to 10, It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So the gleaning is part of what is allowed for Ruth. If you go and look at it in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, it says, when you're harvesting in your field and you've overlooked a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. So allowing Ruth to glean was part of Boaz's obligation. It was part of the law. And that was all he needed to do. Okay. But to offer her water, that was not required. To invite her to eat, that was not required. So basically what he was doing was he was extending her special honor and privilege, which of course she recognized. Now, all of this is of course because he's heard about Ruth. Remember, he asked about her. Who is that woman? Oh, she is the one who did such wonderful things. And so in looking at this story, the law of gleaning has his minimal requirements, but he's going much beyond that because there's a relationship. And Ruth has honored someone who is his kinsman in a very significant way. And her reputation has gotten back to the people in the community. This is a wonderful young woman who's done wonderful things for Naomi, who came back bitter and empty from this other land. And so Boaz is impressed by her, and he really responds to her in that way. Now, if we just take a look at these things, you see it helps us to get a little deeper insight into the story. Helps us to understand the dynamics of what's happening. If we were to use the things about event that we were talking about earlier and focus on the event analysis, there are some other things that we would look at. What is the scene described here? Well, this is kind of a stupid question, actually. It's so obvious that you don't even need to answer. It's the barley harvest, you know. I mean, that's the scene. But if you think about this, okay, what are some of the other scenes that we might study if we were studying this culture? Well, we might want to look at barley planting. We might want to look at what happens after this day. And of course, in the story, we have another event happening later. There's the thrashing event. This is the harvesting event. Now, the next time Ruth is going to encounter Boaz, in the next chapter we'll look at, it's on the threshing floor. And that's where the barley is being processed, beaten off of the stalks, and then prepared for food processing. So this particular scene, you see, is one of a part of a series. And that's what we need to understand. And the story occurs in that sequence of the series. And actually, in looking at the book of Ruth, we have in chapter 2 the barley harvest, in chapter 3 the threshing floor, and in chapter 4 you have the gate, the decision-making at the gate. So there are 3 significant scenes that make up this story. Now, if you wanted to analyze each of them, then you could say, what are the provisions for each of the scenes? You know, you could go through and compare them. What happens on this one? The provisions. Well, you got to have water jars, okay? And you have to have the food, and you have to have something to cut the barley stalks, you know, and you have to have a foreman, and you've got the workers. And so, you know, there's a variety of things. Of course, those are the people that we have involved in the process here, and that gives us some sense of what's happening. The routines. What are the routines in the story? Well, the story actually gives us the cycle of things. You have them going along and harvesting, then them stopping to drink, and then you have them going along and harvesting, then stopping to eat, and then you have working until the end of the day, and then gathering up what is gathered for the end of the day and returning back to the house. It's fairly simple. But there's a rhythm that goes on there that's an interesting part of the story. Boaz coming to see it is an interesting part of the routine. His dialogue and conversation with the people and the things that he said are an interesting part. Norms. Norms have to do with the rules of the game. What are the rules of the game? As I read this story, what does Boaz do to say, you can't play by the rules of the game with Ruth?
Not to touch her.
Okay, men, don't touch her. Apparently, part of the rule of the game was that if a woman's out there in the barley harvest, you can harass her. You know, doesn't say you can't harass her, you just have to let her glean. And so Naomi's afraid of this. Naomi says, you know, stay in Boaz's field, the men won't touch you then, they won't harass you. So that must be part of the dynamic. What else? What are the norms?
She can't go too fast. She can't go too fast.
Okay, and why do you say that?
Well, she said, like, going up to the point where she can work with the men.
Okay.
But so he had to give permission for that. So.
Okay, that's right. She had to stay back behind. That's right. She couldn't get in where the harvesters were. She had to stay back away. Exactly right, James. Good observation. And Boaz said, let her come right up with you and pick up where you are. And so in essence, what he did is he invited her to join where the harvesters were and pick up grain that Boaz would have harvested. And so she could pick up more. And so the rule would be you had to stay back until they were completely finished, and then you could come along and get what they left over. Boaz invited her to come up to the front. If you look at the text carefully, you see you can begin to pick up these themes. You can begin to see the details that they work with and why they do it. The transactions involved. There are a whole series of exchanges in this chapter that go on. There are verbal exchanges. You know, Boaz has greetings exchanged with his laborers, and wonderful exchanges there of blessing upon each other. And then you have the exchange of, you know, what is Ruth giving in this process? Well, what Ruth gave was her service to Naomi. And so what Boaz is doing is he's repaying her. He says, may the Lord repay you, but he's being the Lord's agent. He's giving to Ruth water. He's giving to Ruth food, and he's giving her the right to harvest right in with his men. And so in essence, Boaz is praising God and saying, what a wonderful woman you are, Ruth, and may the Lord repay you. And then Boaz goes about to do what God has told him to do, to be the agent for God to repay Ruth and to encourage Naomi in this process. So this kind of, you know, if you look at these exchanges, you can see why exchange is an important part of the dynamic here. It's very key to the story, and in fact, it brings out some key responses. In Naomi's response is, the Lord bless him, meaning Boaz, and he has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead. Okay? It's interesting that she would say that. That here is an act of kindness not only to us, but to my deceased husband and to my deceased sons. That this is honor. Honor again, you see. Honor given in a relationship and a blessing with that honor. And so Naomi sees that. It's the transaction. She says he's given kindness, showing kindness to the living and the dead. And then that man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsman redeemers. And that's a very positive thing. So these exchanges are an important part. Now there are possible alternatives here, and this is just you know, it's conjecture. Okay, Boaz could have not paid any attention to her at all. There are always women gleaning in the fields who are widows. You know, so who what? You know, why worry about this one? You know, he's not married, so maybe Ruth would be of interest to him. She may have been attractive. It really doesn't say. You know, we never know whether she's beautiful or not beautiful. It just doesn't say that at all. What it does tell us is that he did inquire, and when he found out who she was, he knew about her. And so that's an interesting part of this. Now, what you can do. Could have done nothing. He could have been harsh toward her. You know, there are a variety of ways that he could have acted. Ruth, on the other hand, could have said, huh, you know, because Boaz greeted her and said some kind things, and how Ruth responded, she bowed down with her face to the ground. Well, she didn't have to do that. She could have been haughty. Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? She plays a very, very deferential role in this, very humble role. And, you know, she didn't have to do that. It could have been different. So she could have been Orpah, said, I want to go back home. So, you know, if you think about it, Ruth made some choices. She chose to act in certain ways here, and we see that through the story. Of course, the feedback is given by the participants, and every one of them makes some statements as to what they're going to do. If you think back through the story, Boaz is continually talking about the Lord. So what would you conclude about Boaz as a God-fearing man in this story? It's clear where his values are, isn't it? You know, you see right up front, when he comes in to greet his laborers, he blesses them. The Lord bless you. And so he blesses Ruth. And he claims the Lord's blessing upon her, the Lord repay you. So Boaz has some very clear beliefs, some very clear commitments that he makes in this process. Now it's interesting that Naomi changes too in this story. In the story that we did last week, Naomi was bitter, the Lord is against me. But in this story, Naomi says, the Lord bless him. Okay, so Naomi's reflecting on God's work in her life and God's work with Ruth. Naomi says, pronounces the Lord's blessing on Boaz. So the beliefs and meanings and the feedback that you get in this story give you some insight into how the people behave in the culture. Finally, we have the notion of the literary structure that we have looked at as we look through it. And the literary structure to me is an important part of the story because it expresses God's provision for Ruth and Naomi. The writer of the story is one of the prophets, we're certain. And the whole purpose of the story is to provide a prophetic message to the people in Israel and to show them that there is deep spiritual truth here. And so this purpose of this story is not just to recount the genealogy of David, which it ultimately does, and not just to recount the story of Naomi and Ruth, but really to recount to the people the presence of God and the purpose of God in the lives of the people. And what you see here in this chapter, in this second scene, if you will, is that God cares in spite of the fact that Naomi felt that the Lord had abandoned her, in spite of the fact that everything seemed to go wrong, that God is a loving God and he makes provision for his people. Now, as we look at all of this, that's ultimately where we're at. Why are we interested in studying social organization? Because we want to bring the message of God's love into the world of people. We want them to understand this love and understand the impact of this relationship in terms of where they live and what they do. And the Bible gives us story after story to help us to comprehend this incredible and powerful truth. The whole purpose of my trying to teach you to study social organization, to look at events, to try to understand them in this context, is to do exactly the same thing that the writer of this story, perhaps Samuel, did in recounting it to us. And that is to show people that God is ready to intervene at the center of their lives. That in their times of crisis, in their times of deepest need, that God is one you can depend upon. And that this God is the God that we receive by faith. And it's a God who acts for us in our moments of crisis for our good and for his glory. Out of this story, you have the wonderful transformation of Naomi into a woman who is blessing God and praising God from a woman who is bitter. And you have it done through the ministry of a foreigner, an outsider, a woman like Ruth, who comes into Israel, and according to all the customs of the culture, she really has no place. But Ruth is the agent that God used to bring blessing to these people. We're outsiders. We come into other cultures. God makes us agents of blessing to these people. And he wants us to bring to them the same kind of blessing that Ruth brought to the people of Israel. Well, I hope that the story has given you a sense of how you can take a story like Ruth, how you can begin to think deeply about it. You notice how important the details are. You see, the details in your stories give you the clues to get deeper into the meanings. So that's why you need to collect detail. And you never know which one's going to be important. But what you do know is that those details are the ones that are going to take you deeper into the meanings and ultimately give you the avenue through which you can communicate the profound meanings that you have in Christ. Thank you very much. We'll conclude here.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.